Mr. Muddle. Poor Mr. Muddle just couldn't get anything right. Everything he did, everything he tried, everything he said was muddled. Totally, utterly, completely and absolutely muddled. Imagine, for instance, something simple as hammering a nail into a wall. Now, what can get muddled with hammering a nail into a wall? Mr. Muddle could get it muddled and frequently did. Imagine, for instance, something simple as putting on your coat. Now, what can get muddled with putting on your coat? Well, see for yourself. Only Mr. Muddle would put on his coat like that. Imagine, for instance, something simple as going for a walk. Now, what can get muddled with going for a walk? Well, when your legs start walking one way and you start walking the other, it's a bit muddled sort of walk, and a bit strange. Or if you prefer something a bit silly, and a bit funny. Poor Mr. Muddle, walking one way and going another. Now, you probably like to know where Mr. Muddle lives. In a house by the sea, a place called s10. Mr. Muddle's house was supposed to be in the country, but Mr. Muddle, who built the house himself, got the place muddled up, of course. And you can tell that Mr. Muddle had built the house himself, can't you? He built it looking a bit strange. This story starts one evening fine afternoon when Mr. Muddle was having breakfast at an inn. Yet we know you don't have breakfast in the afternoon. But you do if you get your meal times muddled up. Mr. Muddle was having bread and butter and jam and a cup of tea with milk and sugar. He spread the butter on the table, and then spread the jam on the plate, and then poured the milk on the bread, and then filled the cup with sugar, and then poured the tea on the bread. What a terribly muddly mixed up breakfast. That afternoon, after breakfast, he went for a walk down the beach near his house in order to work up an appetite for supper. Met an old fisherman called George, who he knew quite well. "Afternoon, Mr. Muddle," said George. "Good evening," said Mr. Muddle. George smiled. "How would you like to come fishing with me?" he asked. "Oh, no, please," replied Mr. Muddle eagerly. "Help me push the boat out from the beach," called George. "Right here," said Mr. Muddle, and pulled the boat further onto the beach. "Oh, Mr. Muddle," said George. He had to show Mr. Muddle the difference between pulling and pushing. However, eventually, somehow or other, they managed to get the boat out to sea. "Now let's fish," said George, dropping a fishing line over the side of the boat. "Right here," said Mr. Muddle, and dropped himself over the side of the boat. Splash! "Oh, Mr. Muddle!" said George again. It wasn't any good, and I didn't catch any fish, so they decided to go home before it became dark. "Help me pull the boat up onto the beach," called George. "Right here," said Mr. Muddle, and pushed the boat back into the water. George was just about to say, "Oh, Mr. Muddle," again, but he hadn't had He smiled to himself. "Help me push the boat out into the sea," called George. "Right here," said Mr. Muddle, and pulled the boat up onto the beach. "Well done, Mr. Muddle," "So," said George. Mr. Muddle smiled a smile and went home. George smiled a smile and went off to tell everybody. The following day, in said town, Mr. Brick the builder asked Mr. Muddle to hold his coat for him. "Right, sir," said Mr. Muddle, and he held his letter for him, which is what Mr. Brick fairly wanted. "Well done, Mr. Muddle," smiled Mr. Brick, and been talking to George. Mr. Muddle was very pleased. Then Mrs. Scrub at the laundry asked Mr. Muddle to pass her soap. "Right, sir," said Mr. Muddle, and passed a clothes peg, which is what Mrs. Scrub Rowley wanted all along. "Well done, Mr. Muddle," smiled Mrs. Scrub, who had also been talking to George. Mr. Muddle was extremely pleased. Then Mr. Blake the coal man asked Mr. Muddle to lift a sack of coal down from his lorry. "Right, sir," said Mr. Muddle, and lifted a sack of coal up onto the lorry, which is what Mr. Blake Riley wanted all along. "Well done, Mr. Muddle," smiled Mr. Blake. George had told everybody. Mr. Muddle was very delighted. And in fact he was so delighted he decided to go home and cook himself a large meal to celebrate. Roast turkey, peas, potatoes and gravy. He put the turkey in the cover to cook, peeled the peas and put the potatoes in the refrigerator to boil. And you know something else he did? He tried to slice the gravy. "Oh, Mr. Muddle, how strange is that?"